Some of the questions we're hoping to cover tonight. Is it possible to stop North Korea from building nuclear weapons? Is it realistic to even have that on the table? Can North Korea be lifted out of poverty and isolation? Are we headed to war? What would that look like? What's at stake for North Korea, South Korea, Asia, and here at home in the United States? We're so fortunate to have these leading experts with us here tonight. Many of them have traveled far to be here. Sung-Yoon from Massachusetts. Corey's on her way from Palo Alto right now. Danny from Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Stefan from San Diego, and Jinmin right here in our backyard in San Francisco, so thank you all. Let's start tonight with President Moon and President Trump when they met last month. Jinmin, this is for you, at the Blue House in Seoul. It was the president's first trip there. What are the major takeaways?
Yes, it was, the visit was made on November 7th, quite recently last month. And it was actually a first state visit by a U.S. president in 25 years. So it's quite significant in that sense as well, too. And they had a very good meeting. They had very candid discussions about the steadfastness of the Republic of Korea and United States alliance and how important that is. And also, they've also agreed on resolving the North Korean nuclear issue in a peaceful manner based on an overwhelming superiority of power. So it should be based on superiority of power, and that's based also on the robust Republic of Korea-U.S. alliance. So that has been a very significant part of his visit to Korea, that we maintain a very strong alliance, and also which should be based on the overwhelming superiority of power as well, too.
So, Sung-Yoon, can you put this into context for us, some of the history, the patterns of the relationship between the U.S. and Korea, so we understand where we are today?
In line with the theme of the hour, the alliance, I think the most valid or persuasive evidence of the strength of the alliance is the past 6 decades of history. Since the end of the Korean War in 1953, there has been no war in or around the Korean Peninsula. Whereas if you look at the 60-year period leading up to the outbreak of the war in June 1950, I count at least 4 major wars: the First Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the Pacific War. And there was even a plan for a joint U.S.-Korea coalition for the invasion of the Korean Peninsula, which did not become necessary in the wake of the atomic bombing. So the fact that the U.S. has been committed to the defense of South Korea has been an essential factor in the de facto peace, no war, that Koreans have enjoyed, mostly in the South, of course, whereas the past 7 decades of the conditions of life inside North Korea has been unique in its extreme repression. And President Trump's speech to the National Assembly on November 7th, I noted that this was the first time a U.S. president presented a litany, a very detailed criticism of North Korean human rights violations. President Trump mentioned infanticide, religious repression, the insidious class system with its lifelong grueling ramifications, slave labor, widespread grinding poverty and hunger, and so forth. And he said this: the very existence of the South Korean, a thriving South Korean republic, presents a challenge to the very survival of the repressive North Korean republic. That dynamic in the Korean Peninsula has very important implications. You have a 2-Korean state formulation, an ongoing contest for pan-Korean legitimacy. And although it is clear to most of us around the world which Korean state is the more legitimate, successful, richer, freer state, for North Korea, the sheer existence of a thriving alternate South Korean state across the border presents challenges. It's an existential threat. Thus, they are bent on increasing their menacing capability.
So, Stefan, What are the chances of Trump and Kim focusing on economic development versus missile tests?
Boy, that would take a settlement. I don't think you're going to get there anytime soon. But let me just say something about the North Korean economy
The mic up.
that might put this in context. At the end of the Cold War, North Korea fell into a famine that killed about 600,000 to 1 million people. So somewhere in the vicinity of 3 to 5% of the population. It's kind of an extraordinary event, and obviously one that touched everyone in that society. But there was one curious outcome of that event, which was that the economy started to marketize from below. The public distribution system collapsed. We were just talking about that. And so you have households becoming extremely entrepreneurial. So you have a kind of sclerotic state socialist system. You have this very large defense industrial complex, which eats up a lot of resources. And then you have these households that are trading, forming businesses, moving around, and so forth. And so, the development task for North Korea is basically to get on a path where those kind of energies which have already been unleashed would move forward. But we haven't seen the regime showing much interest in a kind of a de jure reform package, that is, the kind of experimentation you saw in China. I mean, the regime's letting this go, but it's not really doing much to advance that process, and is spending a lot on the weapons program.
So what's the U.S.'s role in all of this? And maybe that's a question for Danny. Or Stefan, feel free.
I think let Danny take that. I mean, I'll just make one comment on this, which is I think the United States stands ready to invest, trade, do everything that we would do with a country if relations could be normalized. And we've said that repeatedly, but it hasn't served as an adequate inducement for the North Koreans to change their mind.
Right. Well, Margaret, first and foremost, the U.S. role is to maintain security and stability on the Korean Peninsula. So our alliance with the Republic of Korea, with Japan, are tremendously important. There has been a lot of consistency in U.S. policy from Bush to the Obama, now to the Trump administration, in that the things that were put on the table in the prospect of a settlement with North Korea, things that the U.S. would do in terms of economic assistance, diplomatic normalization, replacing the existing armistice with some sort of peace arrangement. All of those things remain entirely viable from the U.S. point of view. The problem has been on the reciprocal North Korean side, that North Korea has abandoned its commitments and its pledges to work to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and instead has doubled down on this extortionate gambit to try to cow and compel the U.S., the Republic of Korea, the international community to accept it as a legitimate nuclear state.
You were quoted in the New York Times this morning saying something to that effect. The title of that article was "White House Corrects Tillerson on Whether U.S. Will Talk to North Korea." Can you talk a little bit about the disconnect, and Tom referred to this in his introductory remarks about those comments, and maybe break it down for the audience here who may not have seen the headlines.
Okay. Well, I mentioned the continuity and consistency in U.S. national interests and in policy. The other side of the ledger is a considerable amount of confusion within the administration about what our objectives are, what our strategy is. Confusion perhaps between where President Trump is and where Secretary Tillerson is. There have been other instances, such as when Secretary Tillerson was flying back from Beijing and the president tweeted, "Don't waste your time, Rex. I'll handle this. Forget about this diplomatic effort with North Korea." What occurred yesterday was the speech that Secretary Tillerson gave in Washington, in which he said at one point, I'd like to have talks with North Korea completely without preconditions. In fact, if they want to talk about the weather, if they want to talk about the size of the table, that's fine with me. It doesn't have to be about denuclearization. That's a radical departure from the consistent U.S. and the consistent Trump administration policy, that the crux of the problem is North Korea's threatening nuclear missile program. That has to be on the agenda. There's been a general openness to the idea that there will, of course, be lots of things on the table. But talks for talk's sake is exactly what each administration has said they're not interested in. The goal of the entire sanctions regime, in fact, is to apply pressure on North Korea for a purpose. And that purpose is to convince Kim Jong-un that he's not going to be legitimized as a nuclear power. The sanctions will not be removed. He's got to begin some negotiating process to freeze, to halt, to roll back, and ultimately to dismantle his nuclear and missile program. The president was, the White House, as you alluded to, issued a statement that seems to be pulling the policy and the secretary back to the more conventional line.
What about these sanctions, though? They're not working, right? Stefan, do you want to share what they are and where you think they're going to go?
Well, sanctions don't work until they do. So I think it's a little bit of a premature conclusion to say that the sanctions aren't working. I mean, when they do work, as they did in the Iranian case, they manifest themselves in quite rapid economic collapses, and that's what drove Ahmadinejad back to the negotiating table even before Rouhani was elected, actually. So I don't think we're in a position yet where we can say that they haven't worked. If we go back to when the crisis broke around 2002, 2003, you had about 20% of North Korea's trade was with Japan, 20% with South Korea, and 20% with China. And what's happened in the interim is partly because of the sanctions, you've had this giant sucking sound of China eating up about 80 to 90% of Korea's external economic relations. And that's made it much more difficult to coordinate pressure because the Chinese have been reluctant up until the last year and a half or 2 years to really go after commercial trade. They were willing to go after weapons of mass destruction related trade, but not until recently have we seen these willingness to cut the exports of coal, of seafood, of textiles, and goods like that. And of course, there's some reserves sitting out there that the North Koreans can draw on, and they're drawing those down, but we don't know how large they are. And I don't think the position they're in currently is sustainable, frankly. It's likely at some point that they'll face serious balance of payments constraints. And that's connected with the logic of keeping the pressure on so that the regime will change its mind.
Corey, I'll give you a few more minutes to get settled. We'll go to China. Danny, where does China stand in all of this?
Well, I just got back, Margaret, from a week in China, and I think that there's a tremendous amount of overlap between the U.S. And the Chinese approach and our goals vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula, but they're not identical. There are some divergences as well, and the Chinese have made clear that they're not going to take action such as completely terminating all oil shipments that they think could precipitate a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. A crisis in North Korea is what, in fact, they're trying to avoid. And they also don't want to be on the receiving end of North Korean anger and threats. That said, there's no peaceful solution to the North Korean nuclear and missile threat that doesn't include a very substantial degree of U.S.-China cooperation. And in diplomacy, you can only get so far arm twisting and nagging. You really have to find the common strategic interests and be able to have a sufficiently honest dialogue, in this case between Beijing and Washington. Now, Kim Jong-un is pushing us both in that direction. The Chinese have a very considerable amount of leverage, for reasons Stefan alluded to, but very little influence. They recently sent Song Tao, the senior party official handling international relations, to Pyongyang, and one of the things I heard from my Chinese friends was a sense of outrage, not only that, despite the fact that Song Tao is going as an emissary of the Communist Party of China and of Xi Jinping, who's just come out of the 19th Party Congress strengthened, but not only was he not received by Kim Jong-un, but in his meetings, the North Koreans didn't even offer him a glass of water. And in the Asian context, that says it all. So for China, the United States, of course, with the Republic of Korea and Japan and ultimately Russia to show real unity is a critical piece of at least the political and the psychological war that is already underway. And so for that reason, President Moon Jae-in's current visit to Beijing can be extremely important.
Speaking of war, Corey, you teach a course on thinking about war. What do you say about North Korea in your classes?
That there are a lot of military options that could be pursued to constrain or reverse North Korea's nuclear program, but none of them are good options, right? And if you think about the wildest, most successful case, one where Japan, Korea, South Korea, and the United States remain unified and have a common approach, military approach, geostrategic approach to North Korea, one in which the United States and its allies could accurately identify and target all of North Korea's nuclear missiles, all of their mobile missiles, and could, in the space of, say, 5 hours, let's even put them over the top, in the space of 2 hours, could destroy those 8,000 artillery pieces that the North Koreans have heavily defended aimed at South Korea. Even in that high level of virtuosity of American, Japanese, and South Korean military cooperation and operations, you still probably have 300,000 to 400,000 dead South Koreans. So there's just no good place for this to really go. The Pentagon is trying very hard to come up with exotic new approaches that could protect Seoul, and I hope they succeed. But the reason that the last 3 American presidents have grudgingly allowed North Korea to make progress on their nuclear programs is that there is no preventative option that doesn't run unacceptable risks with respect to the people of South Korea and Japan.
Can you go a little bit further on that and talk about what some of those, what it would look like? The loss of life, the impact on Asia, the impact on the U.S. over here?
So the South Korean leadership has made clear that they believe they have an agreement with the United States that no military action would be taken without South Korea's approval. The White House has tried to finesse that by suggesting that consultations would take place to try and suggest that South Koreans didn't have a veto over military action against North Korea. But South Korea, Japan, and Australia, America's 3 closest allies in Asia, and not just for managing North Korea, but for managing a rising China as well. All 3 of those American allies have said that they will only participate in military operations that retaliate for the use of force by North Korea. So if we choose to fight a preventative war to eliminate the risk North Korea poses, we're on our own. And that not only makes the military operations much dicier, more difficult to manage, but it also changes the geostrategic shape of Asia and dramatically constrains our ability to manage other problems we want to deal with.
Stefan, what do we know about Kim Jong-un? 3rd generation, mid-30s. What do we know, or what do we think we know about his motives?
Well, the one thing we know is something which is highly misleading, as we found with late Soviet leaders, which is there's this idea that because he studied for 4 years in Switzerland, somehow he's enlightened. But it's interesting because he came back and subsequently went through an education, if you can call it that involved going to Korean military academies and subsequent postings in positions at the Organization and Guidance Department, which is a party organization, an internal security apparatus, and so forth. So I think that he's projected an image of kind of modern and youthful and young. But this phase of the dictatorship is actually proving as repressive, if not more so, than that of his father and grandfather. For example, if you look at things like border controls and the unwillingness to allow people to get out. So I think we shouldn't be wowed by the Pyongyang illusion that this is sort of a modern city and it looks like it's developed and developing and it's on the go and so forth, because 20 miles outside of Pyongyang, you're back in a country which has an income of sort of a lower income African country. So, you know, it's a poor country. And I think he's created an image of sort of a progressive quality to it, but it doesn't match the reality.
Yeah, some of the stats are just amazing. The population of North Korea, 25 million people, and half of the population lives in extreme poverty. Sung-Yoon, you've studied this a lot. Can you talk about the landscape of North Korea?
Can I make a different comment related to what we're talking about? Thank you. Since North Korea's third nuclear test on February 12, 2013, we've heard a lot of pundits proclaim that Sino-North Korea relations are at an all-time low. And one reason is because North Korea did it during the Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations, right in the middle of it, which was a message directed at Xi Jinping. But the curious thing is, for the remainder of the year, two-way trade between North Korea and China hit an all-time high of $6.5 billion. The Chinese sign on to UN Security Council resolutions and then do something that I can only explain as a demonstration of diplomatic ambidexterity. They actually increase aid. And another evidence forwarded for the nadir in Sino-North Korea relations we've repeatedly heard is that Xi Jinping has yet to meet Kim Jong-un. It took Kim Jong-il 6 years after he came into power in the wake of his own father's death in 1994 to travel to China. And let me tell a very, very short story. China will go on supporting North Korea, even in the face of direct insult at the supreme leader, the paramount leader, by the Kim family. And there are many examples I could give you over the past 6 decades, but let me just give you one. In the early 80s, Kim Il-sung declared that his son, Kim Jong-il, will be the heir apparent, and this became a thorny issue because hereditary father-to-son succession goes against the core ideology of communism. So they had some work to do. And Kim Il-sung visited Deng Xiaoping in September 1982, and cozying up to Deng said, "We really honor your reform economic program. I will send my son to Sichuan province, your hometown, the laboratory for China's early reform programs, to study your plan. Please teach us." And Deng Xiaoping was pacified, and he even set up a task force within the Foreign Ministry of China to transfer knowledge to North Korea. Next year, in June 1983, Kim Jong-il himself traveled and met with Deng and went even a step further and said, "We want to talk to the Reagan administration. Please help us." So Deng Xiaoping was only too pleased to serve as the conduit, the messenger to the United States. Please talk to them. They're not crazy. They're coming around. They're reasonable. We can do business with them. And Deng was very pleased to do that. On September 30th, still in 1983, Caspar Weinberger visited Deng in Beijing, and that was a big deal back then during the Cold War. On the same day, just to pacify North Korea, Deng Xiaoping signed an agreement to give gratis North Korea 20 outdated but real Chinese warplanes, A-5s. What happened next month? In October, the very last time Deng Xiaoping or the Chinese government conveyed that message, talked to North Korea, to the Reagan administration, happened to take place on October 8th. The next day, a bomb went off in Rangoon at the Martyrs Mausoleum in Burma for the South Korean president. 17 high-ranking officials were killed, including the foreign minister. The North Korean agents were apprehended. It became known that this was masterminded by Kim Jong-il himself. Deng seriously lost face and said that Kim Jong-il, rotten egg, as long as I live, he will never set his foot on Chinese soil as long as I live. But what did Deng do? Delivered on the warplanes. My point is, until the carrying cost for China of continuing to coddle North Korea becomes financially intolerable, the scale of fines we've seen the Obama administration levy against even allies like the biggest bank in France, $9 billion for violating US sanctions legislations on Iran and Sudan and Cuba. Until we see that scale, that magnitude of financial blow inflicted on Chinese banks and state-owned enterprises, China won't budge.
Any reactions on that from the panelists?
Well, my experience with China as a diplomat is that brute force is not a successful tool, generally speaking. But I do think that I agree with Professor Lee that the Chinese have, and including Xi Jinping, have shown an astounding tolerance for insult from the DPRK, but that is, I think that is eroding. And it's not merely that they consider him to be an insufferable and insubordinate neighbor, but that the Chinese see a strategic threat from North Korea's headlong pursuit of a nuclear missile capability. One scenario is one in which there's a collapse of North Korea and the unification of the entire peninsula on South Korea's terms and the prospect of an American military right on the Yalu River. Another is a war, even a nuclear war, or a war that creates a nuclear fallout that contaminates China. The Chinese also see a nightmare scenario in which an unchecked North Korean nuclear program spawns a nuclear-capable South Korea and a nuclear-capable Japan, with perhaps Vietnam and Taiwan to follow. So from Xi Jinping's point of view, there's an awful lot to worry about. He certainly has tolerated any number of insults, but I think that the strategic threat posed to China is such that it's no longer unimaginable that the United States and China could make greater common cause to find the right pressure tools.
I have a slightly different view on that, which is that if I were sitting in Beijing, I would be pretty happy with the way this is developing, right? That the North Koreans are unlikely to use any of those weapons in China's direction. And by accelerating their nuclear and missile testing, the North Koreans are putting an enormous amount of pressure on America's closest alliance relationships in Asia. And it looks to me like one of China's premier national security goals would be to peel apart America's alliance relations in Asia. And so the North Koreans moving forward in the way that they are means that the North Korea problem is in the center of America's agenda for Asia, which makes it a lot harder to make progress on a lot of other things that we want to do. It puts our alliances under pressure, and it distracts attention from China's bad behavior in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the way that they are trying to kick around smaller countries in the region. So I think the Chinese are sleeping just fine with the way North Korea is progressing.
So why don't we spar here a little bit, see if we can
Hold the mic up for the cameras.
I agree with you about deflecting attention from the South China Sea. I would say that, but here's a president who ran on a tremendous amount of skepticism toward the alliance, and it seems to be pulled back towards sending reassurance tours. I don't see the alliance as really weakened as a result of what's happened over the last 2 years with respect to the North Koreans. It seems like even a left president, a center-left president in Seoul, and a Trump in Washington managed to have at least a reasonably successful visit that underlined that the alliance was in good shape and so on. So I think I worry about China believing that South Korea is in play and thinking that they can manipulate that bilateral relationship. But it doesn't seem like the effect of North Korea's actions recently is to weaken the U.S. relationship with either Japan or South Korea.
I do think the Trump administration and the defense secretary in particular have done a very good job of holding hands with the South Koreans and the Japanese as temperatures rise over the North Korean problem. But there's a lot of space between where we are now and managing the North Korean nuclear problem successfully. And in that space, things get harder and harder in the South Korean-American and the Japanese-American relationships.
I think there's a lot of truth in what both panelists are saying, but it reflects the fact that there are conflicting, paradoxical interests on the part of the Chinese. On the one hand, they would much prefer that the U.S. military and the Pacific Command focused all of its attention on North Korea, and that the basic equation was the U.S. was a demandeur soliciting Chinese assistance in dealing with this problem. At the same time, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. South Korea, U.S. Japan alliances are being strengthened. Stefan mentioned, here you have a progressive president of South Korea who, through the Nomuhyun era, was an architect and implementer of the Sunshine Policy, who is behaving in a manner that's almost indistinguishable from Park Geun-hye or from Im Yong-bak. There's one reason for that, and his name is Kim Jong-un. That behavior is what is behind the deployment of THAAD. It's behind the deployment of Aegis cruisers. It's behind a increase and an adjustment to Japanese policies, which the Chinese find very troubling. And so while they may be, there are groups and stakeholders within the Chinese system that see profit from North Korea's behavior. More broadly, certainly in Jonanhai, there is a great trepidation and great unhappiness about the net effect of North Korea's intransigence.
Jimin, can you give us South Korea's take on China as it relates to North Korea?
As its relation to North Korea, well, in terms of China's relations, it's been an ally of North Korea since the Korean War, almost, if you can see. So it's a very difficult situation for them as well. But in terms of, for example, in our perspective, our president is right now visiting China, an official visit, and it's on a state visit, and we try to maintain a very good relations with China as well. And we feel that in the issue related to the North Korean issue, China should be a very important role, especially in terms of the sanctions and pressures. The Chinese government has joined the United Nations Security Council after the September 3rd nuclear test by North Korea, and after 9 days, China has joined in the United Nations Security Council. They're participating in those sanctions. And so they're a very key in this sanction and pressure, where we try to maximize the sanction and pressure to make North Korea come out to the dialogue table. So we feel that it's very important that they play this key role in pressuring North Korea through sanctions.
Stefan, can you break down some of the details of these sanctions?
Oh, I don't know if you really want that. I mean, the sanctions are extraordinarily complex because, of course, the United States doesn't do any trade investment with North Korea. So there's no way that we can directly leverage North Korea by saying we're going to cut off American trade. There is no American trade. And actually, there's not much Russian trade, frankly, either, because there isn't much complementarity there. So, but the big innovation of the last 2 years, and this was an authority that was granted to President Obama, and he chose not to use it as fully, is that President Trump has taken steps to impose what we call secondary sanctions. And the secondary sanction is a sanction against a party that is trading with North Korea. So it's using the leverage of access to the U.S. financial system in order to go after large Chinese groups in particular, Russians to a lesser extent, that are involved in this trade. And I think at least some of Chinese behavior, this is a hypothesis, it's not a stated fact, that some of the adjustment that China has been making on the sanctions front is in recognition of the fact that the United States is willing to use this tool and go after Chinese firms that are engaged in this bilateral trade. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue to do that. That seems to me to be a legitimate use of American economic power because it's sending signals both to North Korea and to Beijing that we take this issue very seriously. So.
Okay, we might open it up to questions. And I still have a couple more, but we'll let the audience chime in. So we have one question over here. We have a microphone that's going to come to you.
Thanks. So, we've been talking a lot about military conflicts and options. I sort of wonder, what the panel's thinking about, what we know about how dictatorships fall apart on their own organically, and sort of how that applies to North Korea, and also what a peaceful path forward looks like. We know that from other countries, removing the dictator overnight doesn't always help because you have a country without institutions or practice at, participating in the political process. And so I'm wondering about some of those issues.
I think that's a fantastic question. And the answer is we don't know nearly enough to be able to do any reasonable planning on it. I mean, I can see the arrow going two different directions, for example, right? The notion that the control of the regime in the north begins to erode and people begin to flee south. What do we do in those circumstances? Do you prevent them from coming south? The scenario I am scaredest of in a North Korean context is one in which Kim Jong-un is overthrown or begins to believe he will be overthrown by other forces in the society and decides to go out in a blaze of glory because he then has nothing to lose. And I can see that being a situation extraordinarily dangerous for the United States, for Japan, for South Korea. We don't know, I at least don't know enough about how the North government, how power's distributed, for somebody who's killing family members with anti-aircraft guns, does that tell you he's actually in a very brittle position and likely to be overthrown, or does that tell you he's in complete control and has freedom of action? I just think this is a problem in which we know so little that we need to have an enormously wide margin for error, because I'm not even sure that what we believe we know about authoritarian regime change, as it has occurred in other places, has much applicability to North Korea. But others may know more than I.
This is such an important question. We should probably spend a little time on it because, and I hear from others as well, because I thought this was a good start. So typically authoritarian regimes collapse in one of two ways. There's either mass mobilization from below, which typically takes place in the capital city, or there's a coup, and then the coup perpetrator wants to get the military out of politics, and you transition in the direction of democracy from that direction. But it's also the case that some authoritarian regimes just become other authoritarian regimes. And so I think we should be careful what we wish for. So for example, you could have a coup in North Korea, which would bring in a military regime in North Korea, which probably wouldn't be very much different than what we have now, except for its ideological trappings. And one of the things, the reason why Pyongyang looks the way it does, just physically, is because the regime has invested very heavily in the capital city for the purpose of avoiding what happened in Seoul in 1987 and what happened in the Philippines. So I'm not banking on this regime changing or changing in a way which is positive. I think if we could get it to go in the direction of China, I would be plenty happy. And, which isn't much improvement on the political front. Right?
Danny, it looks like you have a comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, U.S. policy, certainly under Obama, has been not to try to change the regime, but to try to change the regime's behavior, in part because it really is a crapshoot. There's so much we don't know about North Korea or about what would come afterwards. Now, it's easy to imagine that removing Kim Jong-un is a necessary, albeit not sufficient, condition for an improvement. But we don't know that, and that hasn't been the deliberate U.S. policy. Instead, what we see and believe is that there are forces at work. This is a process of attrition, whereby Kim Jong-un is forced to divert more and more of his scarce resources, certainly foreign currency, et cetera, to the nuclear and to the missile program, and there is less and less available to placate the cadre and reward them with Mercedes-Benzes and Hennessy cognac. There's less to give to military readiness and the Korean People's Army. There's less to give to the personal bodyguard. There's less to give to the Ministry of State Security and the other secret police apparatus. And there's less for light industry, heavy industry, for electricity generation. And all of this creates a very significant headwind. Not only does it make it harder for Kim Jong-un to proliferate arms, let alone nuclear material, or to access the international infrastructure of banking and trade and so on, but it also puts him at some increased domestic political risk. The intent is to bring him to a point where, although the last thing on earth he wants to do is to begin trading away his nuclear and missile program, starting that process, starting those negotiations is kind of the last thing on earth available to him to stave off the great risk that he's facing.
Right behind you.
Not Mike. Okay. Excuse me. I wrote this paper this afternoon, so hopefully you can help me untangle it. I call this "Untying the North Korean."
Hold
Knot.
on, is it a question?
No, it's a solution. Which
All right.
is better than the solution.
You
than
have
the question.
15 seconds for a question.
Okay. Well, have to give that up. I don't have a question.
Okay. All right, thank you. These guys will be around afterwards, so you can talk with them then too. Anyone have a question? Great. Over here.
I propose that over the next 5 years, the primary motivation of China, the United States, Republic of Korea, and the DPRK is survival. The U.S. would prefer to avoid an ICBM attack from North Korea. South Korea would prefer to avoid the same. North Korea would prefer to avoid internal collapse. China would prefer to keep the buffer state it has there for historical reasons that you're familiar with. I think in 5 years, we're still going to have a North Korean nuclear state, and it will be accepted by all sides, and perhaps the economic picture will change, but I'd like to get your reaction to that idea.
I don't see a scenario in which the United States will accept, which is to say will legitimize North Korean nuclear state. And the essence of U.S. strategy has been to ensure that Kim Jong-un doesn't get a return on his investment in a nuclear and in a missile program. So although this program is altering and destabilizing the security environment, the fact of the matter is that the very formidable deterrence that the U.S. and the U.S.-ROK, U.S.-Japan alliance musters, and the very strong defense, including U.S. missile defense, continues to create a buffer that makes it difficult for Kim Jong-un to execute his plan. What is his plan? He already has the wherewithal to rain incredible death and destruction, devastation on Seoul, Korea, through the conventional rockets and missiles in the Kaesong Heights, and probably through chemical and biological weapons as well. He doesn't do it. Why? Because Kim Jong-un is not in the war-fighting business. He's in the extortion business. He is shaking down China, the United States, South Korea, Japan. He's trying to extract rent from us in order to slow him down and sustain some peace and quiet. The challenge and the question is, if he can't extract those benefits and therefore has nothing to show for this investment in a nuclear missile program, can he survive? That's what we're putting to the test.
And to add to that, I agree that Kim Jong-un, his ultimate motive is for the survival of his regime. And if he were to do any provocation, that would be suicidal. And therefore, the regime survival is the main objective of Kim Jong-un. It's something that I would like to pinpoint as well, too.
I see a question in the back. Yeah.
Hello. I think you made a good point earlier when you mentioned that some of the sanctions are specifically tailored to the kind of elite cadre of the country. It seems like if the sanctions were to impose some harsh realities on the average person in Korea, it could maybe reinforce the rhetoric of the regime and actually kind of ossify the dictatorship. Do you know if the sanctions have been more tailored in recent years to target that kind of specific elite military class under the Juche system?
Well, first I'd stipulate that there is no such thing as an average citizen in Pyongyang, as Stefan was alluding to. There are political elites who live in Pyongyang, and then there are serfs who live in basically 15th century conditions. It's impossible for the external countries, for the United States and the international community, to avoid the regime in Pyongyang imposing great deprivation on the citizens outside of Pyongyang. We've tried in the past with limited success to provide humanitarian assistance to the people in the countryside again and again to see that diverted to the Korean People's Army, etc. The short answer to the question is yes and no. Yes, the United States and the Security Council resolutions themselves are, in their design, aim to impose penalties as directly and specifically on the perpetrators of the nuclear and missile program, as well as the big human rights violators and proliferators. But these are not smart weapons often. It's quite difficult to ensure that the right people and the right entities are punished. The North Koreans use front companies. They are constantly changing names. And as Stefan mentioned, they have relatively limited exposure to U.S. or to international sanctions. So it's pretty hard to impose penalties that we can be sure will get to the right people or will not result in greater hardships for North Koreans in the countryside, although we certainly try. I do think that in the last several years, we have made some strides in directly penalizing North Korean entities and individuals, particularly those who have gone and work overseas or travel overseas. We've made it very hard for many of the, whether it is the Office 59 procurement people or whether it is the scientists involved in the nuclear program or the missile program, we've made it hard for them to operate and hard for them to leave North Korea. But it's quite a challenge.
Stefan.
I just want to say one brief thing about the humanitarian question, because with a regime like this is always the most fundamental dilemma, is at the same time you're involved in coercive diplomacy, you're also seeking to signal that the United States has no ill intent towards the people of North Korea. And just as a matter of fact, you might be interested in knowing that the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and particularly the World Food Program, are operating with a handful of European NGOs in North Korea. And I think that work is actually quite important because it at least sends a signal that to the extent that the outside community, including the United States, which, by the way, has an incredible, generous history with respect to providing food assistance to South Korea during the famine, to North Korea, excuse me, it doesn't wish any ill. And so, we need to design these sanctions in such a way that humanitarian exemptions are robust and that community that's in North Korea can continue to operate.
And just to add, sorry, and since we're on the topic of the sanctions, we recently, I don't know if you've seen the news, had a North Korean military person defect across the joint security area in Korea. And when he arrived, he had like 6 bullet wounds. And when he arrived at the hospital and he got his conscience back, and he asked to see the American drama and also the Korean music. So the infiltration and insemination of these pop culture from Korea, these are infiltrating actually through these markets called 장마당, and they have this USB. Now it's easier than before to utilize these media mechanisms like USBs and CDs and drives, and those are the type of things that might also have an impact among the average North Koreans, especially the young North Koreans. And that can also in the future affect the situation there, yeah.
This woman in the red scarf up front.
Thank you. I've been waiting, and no one talk with North Korea. My parents escaped from North Korea, and I've been growing. I grew up with seeing them how suffer they are, missing their families, everything they left it there. I remember U.S. been talking with them, making agreement. But what happened is now they successfully made it ICBM, and all these authoritarian individuals say. Like South Korean President Moon and Madame Albright and President Carter, many people we know talk about we should talk. Seems like I remember one day a North Korean representative said, even any kind of sanction, we can go 100 years, which may be true. Like their living condition like a 15th century, they don't need much. If we go war, this time war is a nuclear war. Nobody wants that. Any one of you believe a talk will solve this problem? Thank you.
Corey? Or who wants to jump in?
If I understood the last part of your question, can you say one more time? Do any of us believe what would solve this problem?
Talks.
So I have not seen good faith by the North Korean government at any point in time at which I've been looking at the problem. But I think the point that you made is the crucial one, which is that at some point you hope to create enough pressure on the North Korean leadership that it's willing to trade away something it doesn't want to trade away. And I think talks are essential for 3 reasons. First, because we know so little about what's going on internally in North Korea. It would be useful intelligence gathering. It would be useful for helping us figure out what's actually happening, where there might be opportunities for making trades. The second reason I think talks are important is that if we actually think we are going to need to go to war against North Korea, talks are going to be essential for helping the American public, much less the Japanese and the South Korean public, to understand that there are no alternatives to that outcome. And I just don't think it's possible for an American government to choose to go to war without a long, big public conversation, part of which includes negotiations with the adversary, in order to persuade my mom that we actually need to do this. And the third reason I think talks are important is that I don't think the Japanese and American and South Korean alliance can continue to remain solid if we don't attempt to persuade the North Korean government to do something different. And so I think talks may well be more important for us than they are for solving the problem, because it's about cementing our alliance relationships, it's about persuading the American public that we need to take action here, and it's about figuring out more than we know now about the North Korean leadership's decisions.
Thanks. Well, I actually have negotiated with the North Koreans. I was part of the agreed framework team led by Bob Gallucci that in 1994 successfully reached an agreement with the North Koreans. And so I know what it feels like, I know what it sounds like, I know what it smells like when the North Koreans are exploring the possibility of making some sort of deal. And for 8 years in the Obama administration, I desperately searched for signals that they were willing to talk. But what I concluded is I think North Korea would certainly be willing to negotiate. They'd be willing to negotiate with the exit of U.S. forces from South Korea. They'd be willing to negotiate a confederation and the preeminence of Pyongyang over the entire Korean Peninsula peace regime. But they're not willing to negotiate the strategic threat that it risks destabilizing the Northeast Asia and upending the global non-proliferation regime. I joke that, in my experience at least, Kim Il-sung negotiated but then cheated. Kim Jong-il pretended to negotiate, but Kim Jong-un refuses to negotiate at all. The sad fact is that it is the United States that appears most interested in talks, in negotiations, because we have worked for now 6 decades to prevent war, and we've worked for 6 decades to support and enforce the non-proliferation regime. And both of these traditions are directly threatened by what the DPRK is doing. So to me, the bottom line is that the question is not whether the United States is willing to talk. The question is whether there is a way to compel, since it doesn't look like we're going to persuade Kim Jong-un, to compel Kim Jong-un to begin negotiating. And I'm convinced that the North Koreans would find the U.S., South Korea, and Japan flexible and reasonable partners, as long as we could see and have confidence that we were moving in the direction of a reduction of the threat, a reduction of the nuclear and the missile programs, with a goal ultimately to eliminate them.
If I may add a little bit as well. Also, Corey has mentioned that North Korea is a very opaque society, and therefore it's very important for us to maintain the situation in a stable manner. To maintain the situation in a very stable manner, it's important to have an inter-Korean dialogue to see what's going on. The North Koreans are testing the nuclear weapons. How is it being conducted? Is it actually being conducted in a safe manner? What are there any emission radiation? These are kind of things that we need to know. So inter-Korean dialogue is an important thing, and that's one of the reasons why the Korean government has proposed to start with something easy, and that is to start with something very easy means to let's start having some separated families reunite again, and as well as to invite them over to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, which is going to be held in February 2018. So let's start out this dialogue, this process, with something that we can do easily, and by step, we can maintain this situation stably and also ultimately go ahead and try to settle a peaceful regime on the Korean Peninsula as well.
Larry, did you have a question? Yes.
I'm sorry, I can't stand. I have the question I have might be seem a little complex or convoluted, but since two previous administrations invaded countries on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, and in all those cases, there were no weapons of mass destruction, but the governments were overthrown, descended into chaos, et cetera, et cetera. With a president now who is a close associate with Xi in China and is developing, frankly, a very positive alliance with many Asian countries, don't you think under this administration we have a very good chance of having a peace initiative with North Korea and in all of Southeast Asia? I mean, Northeast Asia.
I'm a lot more skeptical of that than you are for a couple of reasons. First, I don't sense that President Trump's reflexes are multilateral in that way. I think he feels a lot more comfortable with bilateral negotiations, with bilateral deals, and not just on trade policy, I think on security policy as well. So I'm hesitant to think that he would think of a Pan-Asian security agreement. I could see him thinking we and the Chinese could bilaterally make an agreement and enforce it against North Korea, and to the great discomfort of our allies in South Korea and Japan. But I have a hard time seeing the reflexive, let's go big in Asia. Second thing is, the second reason I'm skeptical to think that's likely is because I'm taking the White House at their word that they say they will not stand for a nuclear North Korea and that they will take military action to prevent it. The National Security Advisor has said quite a number of times that he considers North Korea undeterrable and that the sand is running out of the hourglass. So that rhetoric doesn't sound consistent for me with the notion of undertaking a big, broad peace initiative. But I'd love to be wrong about that.
How about in front here? Thank you.
Hello. So I wonder if you think that the U.S.-South Korea cooperation could be improved in vis-a-vis North Korea, and how? And what would be your policy recommendations if these two countries work together and more or less realistically, made an effort to curb North Korea's North Korean and humanitarian nuclear and humanitarian problem? Where could we be 5 years from now if we followed your recommendations?
Danny?
U.S.-ROK alliance cooperation is good, but it requires constant tending. It's a perpetual work in progress. And the emergence of a progressive government in Seoul and a very conservative government in the United States could have spelled trouble in terms of our coordination and our ability to work together. The spillover from serious differences on trade or the aftershocks from early statements by the Trump administration casting doubt on alliances and implying that South Korea wasn't pulling its weight and was a free rider. All of these could have been very damaging to the alliance, but the Trump administration and the Moon administration, I think as evidenced by the November visit, have found effective ways so far to work past that. There's a test underway now in President Moon's visit to Beijing. The Chinese are using a combination of coercive punitive measures and inducements, as other speakers have noted, to try to weaken the bonds of the alliance and to play to some of South Korea's vulnerabilities. But my view is that our short-term as well as our long-term interests are served by deepening and strengthening not only the military alliance, but the broader political and economic coordination and cooperation between, in the first instance, Washington and Seoul. But secondly, significantly enhancing trilateral cooperation with Japan. We are three liberal free market economies. We are three liberal democracies. We are three countries with a huge stake in the stability of the region, and it behooves us to remove all of the barriers to full cooperation. And that means, of course, building on the important trilateral and the important Seoul-Tokyo bilateral agreements and the progress reached over the last 3 years or so. As far as where we could be, my view is we are in, as I said, a war of attrition where we are steadily constraining North Korea's ability to access the international system. We are steadily impeding its ability to earn money from arms sales, to proliferate. And we are also demonstrating that North Korea won't succeed in its objective of compelling the international community to give up on denuclearization and to accept North Korea as a legitimate nuclear power. We're not denying the reality. It is a fact that North Korea has nuclear weapons and that it has missiles that may very well today be able to deliver those weapons. That's an empirical fact. What we are denying them is the legitimacy of accepting that and allowing them to reap the rewards that accrue to a member of the international community, specifically what they're after, which is the withdrawal of sanctions and opening specific forms of investment that the North Koreans can control to ensure that they don't create domestic political risk for Kim Jong-un.
I can think of one or two things that we could do better. First, and where it will lead. First is I would go even bigger than just closer Japanese, South Korean, and American military cooperation. There are other countries in the region that are also worried about North Korea or that aren't worried about North Korea but want closer cooperation with the United States, South Korea, and Japan for reasons of managing China. So pulling the Philippines and the Philippines and Vietnam and Australia and India and other countries that either care desperately about preventing the erosion of the non-proliferation regime or that care desperately about an Asia where not just the trilateral alliance is strong, but where there are opportunities for even broader cooperation and building a security regime. North Korea may be a useful means to do that, and I think we ought to capitalize on that. I think it's going to be unavoidable, and that could take us to a very positive place 5 years from now, which is more institutionalized cooperation between like-minded states who want to prevent either North Korea or China from extorting or using military force to change existing the status quo in Asia. The second thing I think is that it looks to me that that the countries that fought in the Korean War before 1953 ought to be made more diplomatically active in this. Britain, France, countries that are going to be nervous about what it means for them if there's a war on the Korean Peninsula, can be brought in diplomatically as intermediaries, as envoys, as people to carry messages, and are willing to take sides in this. The third thing that I think is probably inevitable, but is also not necessarily a bad thing, is I think because of North Korea's behavior and because the vulnerability of South Korea is inescapable for those of us who want to protect it, and also because China's half-hearted, sign up to it at the UN but don't really do anything useful approach to it, I think you're likely to see a consolidation of the security relationships for those countries interested in protecting South Korea that looks a lot like Central Europe at the height of the Cold War. I think you're likely to see more militarization of this problem. I think you're likely to see hand-wringing, anxious conversations about extended nuclear deterrence and what that means. And I think you're likely to see bending over backwards efforts by the United States and other countries to make sure that there's very little space for South Korean uncertainty or anxiety about security guarantees. So I think that's going to consolidate because of North Korea and China's behavior. And to the extent that it helps South Korea feel safer in these circumstances, that's a good thing, even though it will further militarize the Korean Peninsula.
More questions? About right there.
So we've been talking a lot about North Korea's nuclear program and its missile ambitions, but we also know that North Korea has a trove of chemical and biological agents and weapons, and so such as mustard gas and VX agents. And so what are the possibilities that Kim will release these weapons in major metropolitan areas such as Seoul? And how could the United States and South Korea potentially curb these dangers?
So I think the chemical and biological risks parallel the nuclear risk. And I think in all three cases, as you said earlier, we actually know what a strong deterrent posture looks like because it has largely worked over the last 60 years. And the right threat is to say, any attack by North Korea on the United States, South Korea, or Japan, whether that attack is conventional military, chemical, biological, or nuclear, any attack on the United States or its allies will be met with military retaliation against the leadership of North Korea, and they will not survive that retaliation. So the threat against the North Korean leadership, not against all of North Korea. And I think by giving so much attention to the chemical and nuclear aspects of the problem, we're actually rewarding bad behavior on the North Korean part. And to suggest that we should be any less committed to the defense of South Korea or any more concerned about war on the Korean Peninsula because it may have those additional dimensions, I think diminishes our ability to deter North Korean action. So I actually think we have the right deterrent threat, and we ought not to let the chemical, biological, or nuclear elements of it seem an important new wrinkle in it.
Up here, there's a question. We have time for 2 more questions, and then I'm going to leave the last question to Tom Gold.
Yeah, so Coming back to what you guys were saying about kind of not allowing North Korea to reap the awards that having nuclear weapons would allow it to do, I was inquiring as to what would be the consequences on U.S. foreign policy regarding the Southeastern Asia region if this issue were to just propagate as is, as there is no currently one viable solution, and the U.S. national security has stated that they won't stand for allowing North Korea to be a nuclear state.
It's a wonderful question. I think buying time is a dramatically undervalued aspect of American foreign policy, because if you don't have a solution, buying time means you don't need a solution, right? And I wish I could see a solution to North Korea's nuclear, chemical, biological, and conventional weapons threat to South Korea, but I don't. And so the status quo is actually worth preserving, and buying time is an honorable way to do that. So I don't think we ought to rush to a worse solution than sustaining the status quo, because especially since, as your question very smartly indicated, many of the solutions that are possible would so dramatically upend the geopolitical balance in Asia, and so dramatically change how countries, especially countries that are American allies, view the United States and the world. Fighting a preventive war would change the way lots of countries think about the United States, and I think ought to be very carefully considered the second and third order effects of doing that, because they don't look to me worth it.
I'd say simply, there's no situation that's so bad that it can't be made worse. And war on the Korean Peninsula is an outcome that all parties have worked to prevent and must continue to work to prevent. But on the other side of the equation, the downstream effects for U.S. interests, and I think for global interests, were the U.S. and others to acquiesce in legitimizing North Korea's nuclear program, which I believe would ineluctably lead to nuclear weapons status for other countries in the region. That also would be hugely harmful to the world order. And so working in that middle ground and continuing to strengthen our deterrence, continuing to strengthen our defenses, continuing to sustain and develop and enhance political coordination and linkages, in the first instance among the allies, but to include others, as Corey indicated. And at the same time to keep flashing the diplomatic exit ramp sign and continue to ensure that the North Koreans understand that they can get far more by way of security and economic assistance and respect at the negotiating table than they can get through the extortion strategy that they have been pursuing.
Right here.
Thank you. I'm just interested in North Korea's position, looking at their deterrence system as one in which they use examples of regime change that the U.S. have been a part of for the last 10 or 15 years, and they look at the process in which foreign policy, where conflict and military action has taken place, has really resulted negatively for the United States. We've spent trillions of dollars on all of these regime change programs of foreign policy, and we have received nothing back so far. In fact, we're still in all those conflicts. So can you see North Korea's side for deterrence looking at our foreign policy of regime change?
Well, I certainly think that the North Koreans look at the Iraqi and Libyan examples and draw a certain kind of conclusion for them that they're better off with nuclear weapons. But that's exactly why it's very important to play this coercive diplomacy in such a way that the off-ramp side of the equation is a piece of that diplomacy. And I think the reason that coercive diplomacy is so hard is because you're simultaneously sending two apparently contradictory messages. One, which is that we are going to continue to use pressure, but at the same time you're saying we're willing to move towards a peaceful settlement in which your legitimate interests will be protected. And I think that we were talking and Danny was schooling me about what he thought about the Tillerson comments, but I do think that one feature of what he said is very important. Here you have the Trump administration, the Secretary of State, saying the United States does not seek regime change, it does not seek collapse, it does not seek accelerated reunification, and for China's sake, we don't seek troops above the 38th parallel. And if we have to put them in, we're going to pull them back. Now, from North Korea's perspective, that might not look like a credible set of assurances, but it's extremely important when you're playing the coercive diplomacy game to continually hold open the willingness to talk. And I think on this point, Danny and I certainly agreed that the problem right now is not that the United States is unwilling to talk, but the North Koreans haven't gotten to the place where they think that talks are able to lead them in a path where those assurances, security assurances, can be provided. And until that happens, there's just not much we can really do.
All right, Tom Gold, last question.
Thanks. I guess my question is also related to regime change, but it's not so much as our subverting the regime or regime collapse, such as you've been talking about it. First of all, how much do we know about how actually institutionalized the regime is versus personalized in the person of Kim Jong-un? We know that he's managed to kill off a lot of his father's close comrades as well as many of his own family members, and there could be a coup. We don't know about that, but I've talked to people who said you also have to consider his health. That he's obese, he's an alcoholic, and he's got diabetes, so that his own life expectancy may not be terribly long. Plus that he has, family-wise, I guess he's recently appointed his sister, right? He's promoted her to something, but his children or children are much too young, so that is there any sense of if he just dies, falls over tomorrow, then what might happen? Is there or any individual or group that could be identified to take over?
I think anyone who looks at this place is really hesitant to tackle this question, but I'll just offer one observation. Every time we've bet on the probability that the regime would not survive, we've typically been wrong. I mean, that was true in 1994. It was true in 2010. It's true after the execution of Jang Sung-taek. It's been true all along. And, the regime is not institutionalized at the top in the same way that the Chinese system is, where you have a functioning Politburo Standing Committee that's a real body and so on. But it's not a weak state. And when I hear the term collapse, I don't know what's really meant, that North Korea would collapse. I mean, this is a very institutionalized, control-oriented system, and the regime has invested heavily in institutional resources. So if I had to hazard a guess, the death of Kim Jong-un, I think, would be followed by a junta. I mean, basically a military regime, some kind of collective leadership. We've seen that in the Soviet system. It happened following the ouster of Khrushchev before the system changed. But I just don't think we should bet on the system collapsing.
What a way to end the conversation. Oh, go ahead.
I guess it's a little impolite to wish someone a premature death, even a brutal dictator like Kim Jong-un, but when in a moral dilemma, seek Shakespeare, and you can seek some comfort in Julius Caesar. In the wake of the assassination of the leader in perpetuity, as he was called, the co-conspirators stand around Caesar, and Cassius says, why he that cuts off 20 years of life cuts off 20 years of fearing death. So an early exit, a premature exit for Kim Jong-un would, at the very least, mean not having to fear constantly being killed. I do believe that the regime cannot continue. I don't know when it would collapse. I don't think there are any signs of any imminent danger to the regime. But for these reasons, I think it's virtually inevitable that the North Korean state will disappear for the following reasons. The Japanese colonial rule in Korea was very harsh, uniquely repressive in many ways. But had the US during the occupation of Japan from 45 to 52 followed Japanese examples in Korea 1910 to 45, the US may have done any or all of the following. Prohibit the speaking of Japanese language, force the Japanese to speak only English, subsume Japanese history as part of American language, impose on the Japanese people the forced adoption of Protestant Christianity as the national religion, have all Japanese change their family names to American-sounding names, conscript by force tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young Japanese men to come to the United States to work in harsh conditions, in factories and so on. Take this a little further, you could even argue, coerce tens of thousands of young Japanese girls and women to work in military brothels. We know the US did none of that. Now, during the past 7 decades of the Kim dynasty, as harsh as Japanese colonial rule was, had the Kim dynasty followed Japanese examples in colonial Korea, the Kim dynasty may have allowed for any one of the following. Let the people choose where to live, what school to send their kids to. Let the people marry non-North Koreans instead of inducing forced abortion and murdering newborns. Let the people the right to accrue some wealth instead of cracking down on markets. Allow the people for some semblance of religious freedom, as Japan granted Korea in the 1920s despite harassment. Allow the people the freedom of information to listen to foreign broadcasts, as Japan did. During colonial period, during the colonial era, there were 3 Korean-owned newspapers in the 20s and 30s. And most importantly, allow the people the right to live. As the landmark 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry report on human rights in North Korea alleges very powerfully, persuasively, the North Korean regime is guilty of the crime of knowingly causing prolonged starvation. For these egregious and unique reasons, uniquely cruel statecraft, if you will, I believe North Korea cannot cope with an attractive, legitimate, richer Korean state across the border, and the income disparity is irreversible. It increases every year. When will that happen? Of course, nobody knows. But I think Kim Jong-un probably feels an existential threat in the success of South Korea and US support for South Korea. This dynamic will continue for the foreseeable future. The real danger lies in prematurely relaxing sanctions by the US and South Korea, not returning to the past ways of the unconventional campaign of giving. The Clinton-Bush administration gave North Korea over $1.3 billion from 1995 to 2008. To put that in context, according to the State Department, North Korea's defense budget at the height of the famine in 1997 was $6 billion. Yet, the US was giving several $100 million a year. South Korea was giving more. China, of course, more. So this kind of subsidizing and sanctioning the same target, and also prematurely relaxing sanctions, as the Bush administration did in the wake of North Korea's first nuclear test in October 2006, returning to talks, resuming food aid, which is fine, but also lifting the financial measures against Banco Delta Asia, delisting North Korea from the state sponsors of terrorism list and turning a blind eye when it was revealed that North Korea had built a nuclear reactor in Syria, which Israel bombed in September 2007. Whenever North Korea poses a threat, creates a political headache, the tendency on the part of both the US and South Korea has been to set the bar low and get North Korea to back off a little bit and then sort of celebrate that success. So I would even argue actually that this extraordinary self-restraint has been very helpful, perhaps even essential to deterring war and maintaining the de facto peace over the past 6 decades. But I think that kind of tendency to seek a politically expedient deal, the more problems North Korea creates, that's what we must watch out for in the coming years. Sorry to be long-winded.
Thank you. That's a great closing. So thank you to Tom Gold, to Asia Society Northern California, our team here. Please meet all of them. We're going to be outside for drinks. Thank you to the Korean consulate and to our wonderful speakers here. If you could stay up here for a picture, that would be terrific.